The sound of Karen's SUV scraping against my locked ranch gate was the kind of noise that made coyotes stop mid-howl. Gravel scattered under her tires as she slammed the brakes, jumped out, and started shouting my name like she owned the place. "Open this gate right now!" she screamed, rattling the iron bars as if she could shake ownership out of them. The morning sun bounced off her sunglasses, her clipboard under one arm like she was ready to issue a ticket to the horizon. I leaned on the wooden post beside the gate, coffee in hand, enjoying the breeze that smelled of mesquite and dust. "Morning, Karen," I said, calm as a cow in shade. "Gates staying shut." That was the spark that lit the whole wildfire, the one that would end with the sheriff standing right where she was, pointing out whose land she'd actually been trespassing on. But that morning, all she saw was a man she thought she could boss around, and all I saw was a storm rolling in wearing perfume and entitlement. She jabbed her finger at me, yelling about community bylaws, HOA regulations, and something about shared access roads. I didn't bother interrupting. She'd been rehearsing this speech for weeks. Ever since I put that heavy steel gate up across the road she'd been using as her personal shortcut to the main highway. It wasn't even on her property, but that detail never mattered to her. She waved a laminated HOA map that didn't show a single accurate boundary, and when I told her to take it up with the county, she laughed like the law was a suggestion written in pencil. "This road belongs to the HOA, not you," she said, tapping the map hard enough to bend it. I took another sip of coffee, looked at the hand-painted sign on my gate that said, "Private Ranch Road," and said, "Funny, I don't see your name on the deed." Her jaw locked, and I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. Karen didn't like obstacles, physical or human. She liked control, and the gate was the first thing she couldn't control. That drove her mad in ways even her HOA power couldn't fix. She started yelling about emergencies, guests, and deliveries, making up reasons why my gate was illegal. When none of that worked, she tried guilt. "We're all neighbors here," she said sweetly. "Why make things difficult?" I smiled and said, "Because it's my land, Karen, not your playground." She stomped her foot, muttered something about fines, and stormed back to her SUV. I thought she'd drive off, but instead she pulled out her phone, started recording herself, and began narrating like she was hosting a crime documentary. "This man is blocking community access to a public road," she said into the camera, voice trembling with fake outrage. I just stood there, wondering what kind of internet fame she was chasing this time. Then, without warning, she called 911. I heard her say my name, my address, and the phrase, "armed rancher threatening residents." That got my attention. I wasn't armed, just holding a mug of black coffee, but I knew how fast things could escalate when someone like her started twisting stories. So I set the cup down and waited. 20 minutes later, the sound of a familiar engine rolled down the road. The sheriff's old pickup truck pulled up behind her SUV, dust swirling in its wake. Sheriff Daniels stepped out slow, like always, adjusting his hat before speaking. He'd been a friend of my late father, and had known this land longer than most people in town had been alive. Karen practically ran to him, waving her phone in his face, shouting about her rights and my illegal gate. Daniels just looked at her, then at me, then at the gate. He rubbed his chin, looked back at her map, and asked one question in that gravelly voice of his. "Ma'am, where exactly do you think you are?" That was the first crack in her confidence. She blinked, pointed at her map, and started explaining something about easement access. Daniels let her finish, nodded politely, and then turned to me. "You mind showing me the papers again, son?" he asked. I went inside the house, grabbed the thick folder that lived in my desk drawer, copies of old deeds, survey maps, and the original land grant that went back generations. Daniels took his time flipping through them while Karen hovered like a wasp. After a few minutes, he looked up and said, "Karen, this road's been private since before your HOA existed. The only thing public about it is the tantrum you're throwing." She froze, her face turning the color of a cooked lobster. "That can't be right," she stammered. "We've used this road for years." Daniel shrugged. Using something doesn't mean you own it. You've been crossing his land by permission. That gate just made the permission official. She didn't take it well. Her voice went up an octave as she argued, flipping through her papers, accusing me of forging documents, bribing the sheriff, and everything short of witchcraft. Daniels just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for her to run out of steam. When she finally did, he said the one thing that made her completely lose it. "Karen, if you don't like it, take it to court. But until then, this gate stays closed." The look she gave me could have curdled milk. She stomped back to her SUV, muttering threats about the HOA board and legal action, before tearing off down the dirt road, throwing up a cloud of dust like her car was allergic to common sense. Daniels watched her go, then turned to me with a small grin. "You sure know how to pick your battles," he said. "I didn't pick it," I replied. "She started it the moment she thought her HOA badge meant something out here." He chuckled, tipped his hat, and drove off, leaving me alone with the gate that had just started a war. The rest of the day was quiet except for the hum of cicadas and the distant sound of Karen's voice echoing in my head. I knew this wasn't over. People like her didn't stop at a locked gate, they found new ways to climb it. But what she didn't know, what would come to haunt her later, was that this ranch held secrets she couldn't outvote, outspend, or outscream. The land was older than her rules, older than her HOA, and soon she'd learn that no amount of shouting could change where the real lines were drawn. The morning after the showdown at the gate, the ranch felt quieter than usual, but that kind of quiet that doesn't mean peace, more like the pause before another storm. The coffee pot hissed in the kitchen as I sat by the window, watching the sun crawl over the dry hills and throw light across the barbed wire fences. My dog, Duke, lay by the porch steps, half awake but alert enough to bark if another HOA car dared roll up the road. Karen had retreated for now, but she wasn't the kind of person who gave up. She was the kind who regrouped, reloaded with paperwork, and came back twice as loud. I knew that because people like her always believed the law was their personal toolbox, and they used it to hammer down anyone who didn't fit their perfect little neighborhood. But my land wasn't part of her neighborhood, and that was the detail she could never wrap her head around. The truth of it went back decades, to a time before the HOA, before even the new ranch roads were carved out. My grandfather had bought this land after World War II, when most of the county was still untamed brush and rocky ground. He built fences with his own hands, dug wells, and raised cattle long before anyone thought of turning this place into subdivisions with matching mailboxes. The old survey map, hanging in my study, still had his pencil marks showing where the creek ran and where the private road began. He used to say, "Land remembers its owner if the owner respects it." I had always believed that, and I never thought I'd have to prove it with legal documents until Karen showed up with her HOA badge and a clipboard full of arrogance. After the first incident, I spent half the day going through my old records again, making sure everything was airtight. My father had kept meticulous notes, and the county clerk had copies of every deed dating back 70 years. The road Karen was obsessed with wasn't just private. It was listed as a historical easement connected directly to our ranch house, meaning it couldn't be claimed, sold, or regulated by anyone outside the original ownership line. I even found an old letter from the county surveyor dated 1985 that specifically mentioned the road being privately maintained and not subject to public easement. That one sentence was the difference between ownership and chaos, and I knew it would come in handy when the next wave of HOA nonsense rolled in. As I flipped through those papers, I found photos of the ranch in its early days, black and white shots of my grandfather standing by the same gate Karen had called illegal. Back then, it was a wooden crossbar, nothing fancy, but it marked the same boundary she now tried to erase. He looked so calm in those pictures, the kind of calm you earn from a lifetime of not being intimidated. That was the calm I tried to channel whenever Karen's voice started echoing in my head. By noon, I got a call from the sheriff. Daniels told me he'd received 3 separate complaints overnight from the HOA office about hostile property behavior. I laughed and asked if that was an actual legal term. He said it wasn't, but Karen had written it like it was part of the Constitution. Apparently, she'd already sent the footage she recorded at the gate to the HOA board, claiming I was creating division and threatening access to community assets. Daniels told me not to worry. He knew the county would side with me. But he also warned that Karen was clever. She'd twist technicalities until they bent in her favor. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be a simple boundary dispute. This was a full-blown power struggle disguised as neighborly concern. That evening, I walked down the road toward the far edge of my land, the part that bordered the new development. The difference was striking. On my side, wide open pasture, mesquite trees, the smell of earth and cattle. On hers, identical houses lined up like soldiers, fences painted the same color, and signs that said, "Welcome to Silver Creek Estates." The HOA logo was stamped on everything from mailboxes to lampposts. It was like a tiny dictatorship with manicured lawns. As I reached the old fence line, I saw new posts driven into the ground on my side, bright orange flags marking what looked like a survey boundary. That's when I knew Karen wasn't just talking anymore, she'd already started acting. I followed the line until I found a stack of freshly delivered stakes and a clipboard left on the ground, the paperwork filled out with her signature. She had filed for a community expansion request that included access through adjacent undeveloped property, which meant me. I picked up the papers, took photos, and headed back to the ranch house, my blood simmering. She was trying to rewrite geography with bureaucracy. That night, I called Daniels again, told him what I found. He sighed and said he'd stop by in the morning. I couldn't sleep much after that, kept hearing my grandfather's words again. Land remembers its owner, and I promised myself I wasn't going to let anyone forget who this land belonged to. The next morning, Daniels showed up with a county file under his arm. He told me Karen had already called the planning department, claiming she had verbal consent to extend the road for community access. I nearly laughed out loud. The only verbal exchange we'd had was me telling her the gate was staying locked. Daniels said not to worry, but I could tell he was irritated too. The county didn't like when HOA boards started overstepping their authority, especially into private holdings. He asked if I wanted to file a preemptive complaint just to have a paper trail, and I agreed. As we were talking, Duke started barking again. A white SUV was creeping up the road, slow and deliberate. Karen stepped out, sunglasses on, holding another stack of papers. She didn't even look surprised to see the sheriff there. "Good morning," she said in that sugary tone that meant trouble. "I just came by to deliver official HOA documentation regarding community access to this road." Daniels folded his arms and said, "Karen, I already told you yesterday, this road isn't part of your jurisdiction." She smiled like a cat about to knock over a glass. "That's what we're here to clarify," she said, handing him the papers. He skimmed through them and raised an eyebrow. "Karen, you can't file this kind of request on land you don't own." She tilted her head and replied, "Ownership is a matter of perspective when it comes to shared resources." "I couldn't help it," I laughed. Out loud. She shot me a glare that could have melted steel. Daniels sighed and handed the papers back. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you stop before this becomes a county issue." She crossed her arms and said, "Oh, it already is." Then she walked back to her SUV, smug like she'd just planted a flag in victory. But I saw it differently. She'd just declared war. After she left, Daniels turned to me and said, "You might want to get a copy of your grandfather's old survey notarized again. We're going to need it." As he drove away, I stood there looking at the road stretching through my land, thinking how something as simple as a strip of dirt could turn neighbors into enemies. But deep down, I wasn't angry anymore, I was preparing. If Karen wanted to turn this into a battle of papers, I had more history and more proof than her whole HOA committee combined. What she didn't know was that the land didn't just remember ownership, it had a way of teaching lessons to those who forgot where they stood. By the time the weekend rolled around, word about the gate had spread faster than wildfire through dry grass. Every neighbor in Silver Creek Estates had an opinion, and all of them were fueled by Karen's dramatic version of events. Apparently, I was now known as the angry rancher who blocked the community road, and Karen was parading around the HOA clubhouse like some kind of suburban general leading her troops to victory. She had turned what started as a simple property dispute into a full-scale campaign. Flyers started appearing in mailboxes and on community boards that said, "Protect our access rights," with grainy photos of my gate. Someone had even taken a picture of me standing beside it and written, "Dangerous individual, confront with caution." I laughed when I saw it, but the deeper I looked, the more serious it got. Karen had formed something she called the Rural Expansion Committee, a fancy title for a group of neighbors she'd convinced to fight for a road they didn't own. Her latest trick was charging every homeowner a $20 legal support fee to cover supposed court filings and surveyor visits. The sheriff told me later that not a single one of those filings existed at the county office. She was just collecting money and power, the two things she loved most. Her next move came on Monday morning, when I woke up to the sound of hammering near the end of the road. 3 men in neon vests were pounding fresh HOA access point signs into the dirt right next to my fence. I walked out, coffee mug in hand, and asked who sent them. The foreman, a short guy with a nervous smile, said they were just following orders from the HOA president. When I asked if they had a permit, he shrugged and pointed to the clipboard. I took it from him, scanned it, and realized it wasn't a county permit at all. It was an HOA maintenance work order signed by Karen herself. I told the man politely that he was trespassing on private property, and if he didn't remove the signs, I'd have to call the sheriff. He hesitated but eventually waved at his crew to start pulling the signs back up. Before they finished, Karen's SUV came barreling down the hill, dust swirling behind her like smoke from a fuse. She leapt out, heels sinking into the dirt, shouting at the workers to keep going. "This is authorized work," she yelled. "He can't stop us." I calmly raised my phone and started recording. The second she saw the camera, her tone shifted from furious to falsely sweet. "We're just performing routine maintenance," she said with that fake smile plastered across her face. "No need to escalate." I didn't say a word, just kept filming until she told her workers to pack up and leave. That was the first time she realized I wasn't playing her game. But Karen never stopped where common sense began. That evening, she sent an HOA-wide email titled "Community Update," defending our rights. She claimed I had threatened her workers and that the sheriff was investigating my violent behavior. Daniels called me laughing that night. "You're famous," he said, and apparently armed with a coffee mug of destruction. He told me not to worry, but he did suggest I start documenting everything. So I bought a trail camera and set it near the gate, just in case she or anyone else tried something sneaky. I didn't have to wait long for it to pay off. 2 nights later, around midnight, Duke started barking. I looked out the window and saw headlights flickering near the gate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the road, boots crunching on gravel. By the time I got close, the lights turned off, and the night went silent except for the rustle of dry grass. The next morning, I checked the footage from the camera and there she was. Karen, wearing a headlamp, cutting the padlock with bolt cutters. She struggled for 5 minutes before giving up and driving off, but not before planting another HOA sign in the ground. I printed a screenshot of the footage and taped it to the gate under the words, "Smile for the camera." That must have burned her worse than the summer sun because the next day, I got a formal letter from the HOA attorney. It was written in the kind of tone that tries to sound polite while dripping with arrogance. It said I was in violation of community cooperation standards and had to remove the gate within 10 days or face legal consequences. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, handed him the letter, and asked if community cooperation was a real law. He chuckled and said, "Only if they wrote their own constitution." He filed it away as evidence of harassment and told me to sit tight. But Karen wasn't sitting tight. By Thursday, she had escalated things again. She hired a towing company and had them park a flatbed truck right outside the gate. When I went out to ask what they were doing, the driver said he'd been told to remove an unauthorized obstruction. I told him he could remove Karen instead if he wanted to do something useful. He laughed awkwardly and said he didn't want trouble. Just then Daniels pulled up, same hat, same calm stride. He asked the driver if he had a removal order. The guy handed over the paper and Daniels' eyebrows lifted. "This isn't a legal order," he said. "It's a community notice signed by an HOA president. You can't tow private property off private land." The driver looked relieved and left immediately, muttering something about never taking jobs in HOA areas again. Karen arrived 10 minutes later, saw the empty road, and started screaming about favoritism and corruption. Daniels told her calmly, "Ma'am, the only corruption here is the way you think authority works." That line spread around town like wildfire. Within a day, half the people in the nearby diner were quoting it. But Karen didn't back down. Instead, she doubled her efforts. She started printing new HOA rules and slipping them under people's doors, adding absurd lines like, "All gates within 1 mile radius of HOA boundaries must be accessible for emergency purposes." Some people started questioning her authority, whispering about how much money she'd collected for legal fees. But others followed blindly, too afraid or too bored to challenge her. One afternoon, I saw a group of her followers standing at the end of my fence line, measuring and taking photos like amateur detective. I waved and said, "You missed a spot," which made them scatter like pigeons. That night, I sat on the porch with Duke and watched the stars. I realized the situation had gone beyond ridiculous. It was turning into a symbol of something bigger. It wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about the line between people who respect boundaries and people who believe they can redraw them whenever it suits them. The land was teaching its own lesson, slow and steady. I could feel it every time the wind brushed through the grass, carrying the scent of dust and defiance. I knew Karen would come back, louder, angrier, more desperate. But she didn't know that every move she made was digging her own hole, and soon, the sheriff wouldn't be the only one reminding her where she stood. The land itself would make that clear, and when it did, there wouldn't be a single HOA rule left that could save her pride. By the time Chapter 4 of this feud started unfolding, the air around the ranch felt different, heavier somehow, like the land itself was bracing for impact. The gate stood tall, unbent, and locked just as I left it, but there was a feeling that something was about to snap. Karen had gone quiet for 3 days, and that kind of silence from her was never good news. Usually, she operated like a storm, loud and constant, always circling until she found something to tear apart. So when she disappeared, I knew she was plotting. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning when I woke to the metallic clang of tools down by the gate. I walked out and saw a bright yellow truck parked beside it, with 2 workers in hard hats cutting through the chain with a power saw. They looked uncomfortable, like they knew they were doing something shady, but the paycheck must have been good enough to keep them going. I yelled out, asking who authorized the work. One of them shouted back that it was county approved, which made me laugh out loud because I knew the county would rather wrestle a rattlesnake than touch this mess again. When I got closer, I saw the paper taped to the hood of their truck, a permit form that looked real until you noticed the seal was printed in grayscale instead of embossed. Karen had forged a county work order. I pulled out my phone, took photos, and told the men to stop. They hesitated until Karen's voice cut through the morning air like a siren. She was standing by her SUV again, clipboard in hand, lips pursed, hair perfect as always. "You can't stop them," she said. "The HOA has full right to maintain shared infrastructure." I told her for the 100th time that this wasn't shared anything, but she wasn't there for logic. She was there for a show. She had even brought a cameraman, some teenager from the neighborhood who was clearly promised extra allowance to film the confrontation. I saw the red light blinking on the camera as she started her speech, pretending to sound official. "This gate," she said, gesturing like she was on a courtroom stage, "is an obstruction to lawful community travel. As HOA president, I hereby order its removal." I didn't respond, just leaned on the fence, calm as could be, and waited. A minute later, the distant hum of a familiar engine rolled up the road. Sheriff Daniels pulled in, his truck kicking up a long ribbon of dust. He stepped out, hat low, chewing gum like a man already tired of this nonsense. "Morning, folks," he said, looking around. "Karen, you forging documents again?" Her smile twitched for half a second before she composed herself. "This is a legitimate order," she said, handing him the paper. He studied it, flipped it over, and then looked up at her with an expression I'll never forget, half amusement, half disbelief. "You printed this on copy paper," he said. "You even misspelled department. Twice." She tried to snatch it back, but he folded it neatly and tucked it into his vest pocket. "That's evidence now," he said. The cameraman kept filming, probably not realizing he was documenting his boss's downfall in high definition. Daniels told the workers to pack up and go, which they did faster than I'd ever seen anyone move. Karen started shouting about interference, corruption, and rural intimidation. He ignored her, turned to me and said, "We might need to bring the county out here officially, just to shut this down once and for all." I nodded, knowing it was only a matter of time before she pushed things too far. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to visit the county office myself. The clerk behind the counter recognized me instantly and sighed. "Is this about the HOA lady again?" she asked. I handed over a copy of the fake permit, and her eyes widened. She called over her supervisor, who confirmed that no such order existed. In fact, Karen had called their office last week pretending to be part of the planning department, asking for temporary access codes for a public maintenance crew. They recorded the call, and the clerk said they'd be sending it straight to the sheriff. That was the first real crack in her armor, the proof that she wasn't just annoying, she was breaking the law. I left the office with a strange sense of calm. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was playing defense anymore. That night, I sat on the porch again with Duke by my side, watching lightning flicker over the hills. The air smelled like rain and dust, that thick scent that only comes before a big storm. I thought about my grandfather and how he used to handle trouble. He never raised his voice, never rushed to react. He used patience as a weapon, and I was starting to see why. The trick wasn't to fight people like Karen head-on, it was to let them collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Sure enough, the next morning she showed up again, but this time she wasn't alone. A silver county vehicle followed her SUV, and 2 inspectors stepped out. She had finally gotten what she wanted, a county presence, but I could tell from their faces that she wasn't getting the result she expected. They walked the property with clipboards, asked a few questions, and within 15 minutes they told her the road was outside of HOA jurisdiction. She tried arguing, waving her fake maps, pointing to some outdated zoning files, but the inspectors didn't budge. "Ma'am," one of them said, "you can't regulate private ranch land under municipal codes. This area predates your development." She looked stunned, like someone had told her the sun was fake. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her try to rewrite history on the spot, but it wasn't working anymore. The inspectors left, and she just stood there for a long moment, staring at the locked gate like it had personally betrayed her. Then she stormed up to me, red-faced, and hissed, "You think you've won? You haven't seen what's coming." I told her I'd be sure to check the mail. She got in her SUV and sped off, throwing gravel into the air. I didn't see her for the rest of the day, but that night, around midnight, the trail camera caught her again. This time, she wasn't alone. She had 2 men with her, both wearing hoodies and carrying shovels. They were trying to dig up the property line markers. One of them tripped over the steel rod buried in the dirt and fell face-first into the mud. They scrambled for a few minutes, then ran back to the car when Duke started barking like a thunderclap. I sent the footage straight to Daniels the next morning, and he just whistled. "She's losing it," he said. "We'll handle it." By Thursday, a new development unfolded. Karen showed up to the county office again, this time demanding an emergency hearing about the unlawful privatization of public space. She even convinced a few HOA members to come along, holding signs that said, "Open the road," like it was some kind of protest. The irony was they were protesting on my private land. The county staff eventually called in the sheriff's deputies to clear them out. Daniels told me later that she refused to leave until someone recognized her authority. That line became a running joke around town. People started using it whenever they didn't get their way, at diners, at gas stations, even at church. "Recognize my authority," they'd say, laughing. But for Karen, it wasn't funny anymore. Every step she took to prove her dominance was only proving how far she'd fallen. That night, I sat outside again, the ranch lights glowing warm across the dark field. The gate was still locked, the land was still mine, and for the first time, I felt the tide turning. Karen had crossed too many lines, and now the law was watching. The storm she had started was about to break, and when it did, it wouldn't be me caught in the downpour. It would be her, standing in the mud of her own making, wondering how a locked gate had managed to shut her entire empire down. The day the county survey team arrived was the day everything finally began to unravel for Karen. I was already up before dawn, sitting on the porch with my second cup of coffee, watching fog roll low over the pastures. The air was heavy with that strange stillness that happens before something big, the kind of quiet where every sound feels important. A crow cawed from the power line, Duke lay by the door chewing on an old boot, and I could hear the distant hum of engines before I could see them. A white county truck, followed by a smaller SUV with the HOA logo, crawled up the dirt road, tires crunching over gravel. I set my mug down and stood as they parked by the gate. 4 men stepped out, 2 surveyors in orange vests, a county representative holding a clipboard, and behind them, Karen in her bright blazer and sunglasses, smiling like she'd already won. She waved to me as if we were meeting for brunch instead of another battle. "Good morning," she called out. "I hope you're ready to cooperate." I nodded slowly and said, "I've been ready since you started trespassing." Her smile tightened, but she turned toward the officials before she could snap back. The county rep introduced himself as Mr. Harlan, a calm, older man who had clearly seen more disputes than he cared to remember. "We're here to verify property boundaries," he said, scanning the area. "Both parties have presented documentation, so we'll take fresh measurements today." I nodded again and motioned toward the house. "I have all my records ready if you need them." Karen jumped in before he could answer. "We actually don't need his outdated paperwork," she said quickly. "The HOA has current development maps approved by the planning board." She handed over a shiny folder with the HOA seal on it, acting like she was presenting evidence in a courtroom. Harlan took it, looked through the pages, and frowned. "These maps don't match the county grid," he said. "They appear to be zoning overlays, not property lines." Karen's voice sharpened. "They're official," she insisted. "They show access roads and shared zones." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "Shared zones? Ma'am, this isn't a subdivision boundary, it's private ranch land." She didn't respond right away, just crossed her arms and muttered something about technical errors. Meanwhile, the surveyors set up their equipment, tripods gleaming in the sun. They worked methodically, checking angles, hammering small flags into the ground. I stood back, hands in my pockets, watching as they traced the land I'd grown up on, the same land my grandfather had fenced with his bare hands. Every few minutes, Karen would step in to point somewhere or argue about where she thought the border should be. The surveyors were polite but firm. One of them finally told her, "Ma'am, we follow the markers, not the opinions." 2 hours later, the results were clear as daylight. The entire road, the fence, and even part of the area she'd claimed for HOA beautification projects were all inside my property line. I could see the moment reality hit her. Her face froze, then went pale, and then turned red all at once. Harlan went over the paperwork carefully, comparing coordinates and lot records, then turned to me and said, "Mr. Walker, your documents are consistent with our findings. The road belongs to your ranch, and has never been public." He looked at Karen next. "Ma'am, I'm afraid the HOA has no jurisdiction here. In fact, your committee has been encroaching about 12 feet past your development boundary." That last sentence landed like a hammer. Karen blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't process what she'd just heard. Then she laughed, that kind of high-pitched laugh people make when they're trying to hold on to control. "That can't be right," she said. "I've used this road for years." "Everyone has." Harlan nodded politely. "Use does not equal ownership, ma'am." She tried again, grasping for something to cling to. "But the HOA maintenance budget covers this area. We've mowed it, we've cleaned it," he interrupted gently. "That doesn't make it yours." There was silence then, a long, heavy silence broken only by the wind pushing through the dry grass. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then she turned and glared at me with that same fire I'd seen before, the one that said she wasn't finished. "You must have bribed someone," she hissed. "There's no way this is legal." I chuckled softly. "Karen, you've been standing on my land this whole time. I just didn't bother charging you rent." That was when she lost it completely. She threw her clipboard onto the ground, pointed a shaking finger at the surveyors, and started yelling about conspiracies and favoritism. One of the men muttered something under his breath about needing hazard pay. Harlan finally signaled to his team to wrap it up. "We'll file our report with the county today," he said. "It will confirm ownership boundaries and recommend a cease and desist order on any further HOA actions in this area." That was the nail in the coffin, but Karen refused to hear it. She stormed toward her SUV, nearly tripping on one of the freshly placed markers. She slammed the door, revved the engine, and sped off, spitting dust and gravel in every direction. Harlan turned to me, shaking his head. "You've got patience, son. Not many would have kept their cool this long." I smiled faintly. "My grandfather used to say, 'Never wrestle a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it.'" Harlan laughed and said, "Sounds like good advice." He and the surveyors packed up, leaving behind a trail of neon flags fluttering in the breeze like victory markers. When they were gone, I stood there alone for a moment, staring at the land stretched out in front of me. The sun was high, the air thick with heat, and the sound of cicadas filled the stillness. I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I hadn't done anything heroic, just stood my ground, but somehow that was enough to drive Karen into chaos. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by. He'd already heard what happened from the county office. He leaned against his truck, arms crossed, with that slow grin he always got when someone else's foolishness had resolved itself. "Heard she nearly fainted when they told her the road wasn't hers," he said. "Almost makes me wish I'd been there." I laughed. "You'll see it soon enough. The whole town's going to hear about it by dinner." He nodded and said, "Be ready though. People like her don't disappear quietly. She'll try something desperate before this ends." He was right. That night, as the sky turned red and the crickets started their song, I looked out toward the fence line and saw headlights in the distance again. She was back, this time just sitting in her SUV, engine idling, staring at the gate. She didn't get out, didn't shout, just sat there for a long time before turning around and driving off into the dark. It was eerie, like she wasn't angry anymore, like she was plotting something else entirely. I stood there for a while, listening to the echo of her tires fade down the road, and felt that uneasy stillness return. The land had been measured, the truth had been proven, but I knew deep down this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the kind of person to lose gracefully. The county could draw all the lines it wanted, but she'd find a way to step over them again. And when she did, the storm she'd started would come back twice as strong, and this time, she wouldn't just be fighting me, she'd be fighting the law, the county, and the truth that no HOA charter in the world could rewrite. The night after the county inspection felt different from all the others, thick with that uneasy kind of quiet that presses down on you and makes every little sound seem louder than it should be. The gate was still standing proud under the moonlight, the new survey markers glinting faintly like stars dropped into the dirt. I sat on the porch with Duke at my feet, listening to the crickets and the low hum of the generator. The air smelled faintly of rain even though the sky was clear. It was that smell that reminded me of summer storms when I was a kid, the ones that rolled in fast and violent, tearing through the valley before the calm returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that something like that was coming again, not from the sky this time but from Karen. She hadn't been seen all day, not at the clubhouse, not on the main road, not even at the diner where she usually showed up just to gossip. That kind of silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. By the time I turned in for the night, Duke was still restless, ears twitching at every creak and rustle. Around midnight, I heard the low hum of an engine far down the road. I got up quietly, moved to the window, and saw faint headlights near the fence line. I waited, watching, until the lights went out but the shapes kept moving. Shadows slipped across the dirt like ghosts. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and walked down the path slowly, each step crunching against the gravel in the still air. When I got close enough, I saw exactly what I feared. Karen and two men, crouched by the survey markers, pulling them out of the ground and tossing them into the back of her SUV. For a moment I just watched, half in disbelief, half in grim amusement. It was like she couldn't stop herself from losing. Every time she was proven wrong, she doubled down, digging the hole deeper. I turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. "Evening, Karen," I said, my voice calm. She froze mid-motion, the marker still in her hand. One of the men whispered something, probably telling her they should leave, but she didn't move. "You're trespassing," I said. Again. She stood slowly, her face pale in the flashlight's glare, then she tried to twist the moment into confidence. "I'm not trespassing," she said. "These markers are in the wrong place. The survey was manipulated." I almost laughed. "By who?" I asked. "The same county that you called here?" She glared, her eyes narrow and wild. "You think you've won, but you haven't. This road belongs to the community. You can't keep it locked forever." I said nothing for a few seconds, then told her the truth in a slow, steady tone that I knew would stick. "I don't need to keep it locked forever, Karen. Just long enough for you to hang yourself with your own mistakes." That made her snap. She shouted something about reporting me for intimidation, but the two men she'd brought looked done with the whole thing. One of them muttered, "Lady, he's right, we shouldn't be here," before climbing into the car. The other followed. Karen hesitated like she wanted to throw one last insult, but instead just shoved the marker into the ground, stormed to her SUV, and sped off in a spray of gravel. The next morning, I sent the footage from the trail camera, because yes, it caught everything, to Daniels. He called back not 10 minutes later, laughing in disbelief. "She really just can't quit," he said. "This is enough for a trespass charge, and maybe even destruction of property." I told him I didn't want to press anything yet. I wanted her to dig her own grave deeper. "You'll get your chance," he said. "Trust me, she's circling the drain." By noon, the town already knew what happened. Word spreads fast in small places, and by the time I went into the hardware store, people were whispering about how Karen had been caught on camera trying to erase county markers. A few folks who'd once sided with her were starting to realize she wasn't the noble protector of property rights she claimed to be. I overheard one of her own HOA board members saying they might call an emergency meeting to reconsider leadership. That phrase alone made me grin. That evening, Daniels stopped by with his deputy. He told me they'd paid Karen a visit earlier in the day. Apparently, when he showed her the footage, she tried to argue that I'd faked it. Then she claimed I'd installed unauthorized surveillance equipment to spy on her. Daniels said he almost laughed right in her face but managed to stay professional. The deputy, though, couldn't resist pointing out that she was admitting to trespassing by complaining about being recorded. She'd boxed herself in again. "We're filing a report," Daniels said. "But more importantly, the HOA board's calling for a vote tomorrow. Looks like she's in trouble." I thanked him, and after he left, I sat outside again, watching the sun drop behind the hills. The light turned everything gold, the grass, the fences, even the old barn roof. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But that thought didn't last long. The next day around noon, I got a call from one of the HOA members. A man named Greg who owned one of the bigger houses near the entrance to their development. He said they were holding their emergency meeting and asked if I wanted to attend as a concerned landowner. I almost said no, but something told me it was worth witnessing. When I arrived, the clubhouse was packed tighter than a cattle auction. Karen stood at the front, trying to hold herself together, clutching a binder of papers and talking fast, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said. "The survey was tampered with, and this man," she pointed right at me, "is exploiting a loophole." The room murmured. Greg cleared his throat and said, "Karen, the county confirmed the survey twice. We can't keep fighting facts." She tried again. "He's a manipulator. He's making me look like a criminal." I stepped forward, not to gloat but to end it cleanly. "You're doing that all by yourself," I said. The room went silent for a second, and even Karen couldn't find words to respond. Greg turned back to the group and said they were voting to remove her as president effective immediately. The motion passed so fast she barely had time to blink. She stood there frozen as her own neighbors, people she'd bossed around for years, turned their backs on her. I left quietly, didn't look back, didn't need to. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the ranch road like fire, and for the first time in weeks, it felt lighter, freer. That evening, Daniels dropped by again, this time with a smirk that told me he was enjoying this more than he probably should. "Well," he said, "the board voted her out, and the county's recommending a fine for unauthorized development attempts. Might even face a small charge if she doesn't back off." He looked out toward the gate and added, "You know, she's been standing on land she never owned, shouting about ownership. That's some poetic justice right there." I nodded. "She built her empire on sand," I said. The tide finally came in. Later that night, I took a slow walk down the fence line. The stars were out, clear and sharp. The wind moved through the grass with a soft hiss, and for the first time in a long while, the only light on the road came from my own lantern. The gate gleamed faintly under the starlight, locked but peaceful, like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. I thought about everything that had happened, how something as simple as a steel gate had pulled the truth out of everyone involved. The land had drawn its own line, unbothered, patient, and absolute. And though I knew Karen wasn't done forever, I also knew she'd finally learned what my grandfather had always said. You can fight people all you want, but you can't fight the land. It always remembers who it belongs to. After the HOA meeting where Karen was finally removed from her little throne, the air around the valley felt cleaner, lighter, as if even the dust itself was relieved. For the first time in weeks, I could drive down the county road without seeing one of her community access signs nailed into a post or hearing about another bogus violation letter. The news spread through Silver Creek estates like wildfire, and everyone had their own version of the story. Some said Karen was seen crying in her car for 2 hours after the vote, others claimed she packed up her office that same night. I didn't believe most of it, but I did know one thing for sure. People who built their power on intimidation rarely disappeared quietly. So even with the peace settling in, I kept my guard up. The gate stayed locked, the cameras stayed running, and I still walked the fence line every evening with Duke at my side. The quiet was nice, almost too nice, the kind that makes you suspicious because you know a person like Karen can't stand to lose without a last word. Sure enough, her last word came sooner than expected. It started with a letter, printed on fancy letterhead from some lawyer's office 2 counties over. It arrived folded neatly in an envelope marked "Urgent" and "Legal Notice." I opened it slowly, half expecting another one of her bluffing tactics, but this time it was different. It was a lawsuit. She was suing me for property interference, emotional distress, and defamation of character. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. The irony of being accused of emotional distress by a woman who had practically built a career out of distressing others was too rich to ignore. Still, I knew better than to take it lightly. People like her didn't need to be right to cause trouble, they just needed to make noise until someone listened. I called Daniels first, told him about it. He came by that afternoon with his usual calm look, reading the letter over while leaning against the porch railing. "This isn't even a real claim," he said. "Half of this is nonsense, and the other half's copied straight from some online legal template." He told me not to worry, that the county records and the video evidence already buried her case before it started. "Still," he added, "get yourself a lawyer just to make it official." I did just that. My lawyer, an old family friend named Bill, had the kind of patience that could outlast mountains. He flipped through the paperwork, shaking his head. "She's desperate," he said. "You don't sue with this kind of nonsense unless you're trying to save face." He drafted a short, clean response. Nothing dramatic, just facts, maps, and a copy of the county report. Within 2 weeks, the case was dismissed before it even reached the courtroom. That should have been the end of it, but with Karen, nothing ever ended clean. Instead of backing down, she doubled her efforts, spinning new stories around town. She told people I had bribed the sheriff, paid off the county, and even hinted that I had falsified land record. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so exhausting. Every rumor was another spark, and the more people laughed at her, the harder she tried to convince them she was the victim. The final straw came when she tried to host an HOA town hall at the diner, claiming it was open to the community. I went, not to argue but to listen. When I arrived, the place was half full, and Karen stood at the front like a preacher addressing her congregation, hands waving, voice high with drama. "They've taken what's ours," she said. "If we let one man close off a road, what's next? They'll take our freedom to walk, to visit, to live peacefully." I sat quietly in the corner, sipping my coffee while the crowd watched her like she'd lost her mind. One older man raised his hand and said, "Karen, that road's never been ours. It's his land, always has been." She snapped back, "That's what he wants you to believe." Her voice cracked, desperate now, the tone of someone realizing the audience wasn't buying it anymore. I stood then, not to humiliate her but to end it once and for all. "Karen," I said, calm and clear, "if you want to talk about freedom, start by respecting other people's property. The only thing I ever did was put a lock on what's mine. You're the one who turned it into a circus." She froze, eyes locked on me, face pale. Then she stormed out without another word, slamming the door so hard it rattled the coffee cups on the counter. The room stayed silent for a moment, then someone near the back muttered, "Guess that's that." Everyone nodded, and that was the day the town finally turned the page on her reign of nonsense. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The HOA board elected a new president, a quiet man named Greg, who wanted nothing to do with drama. He came by one afternoon with a small bottle of whiskey as a peace offering, apologizing for all the trouble. "Most of us never agreed with her," he said. "We just didn't want to get caught in the storm." I told him I understood. It wasn't the first time someone mistook silence for agreement. He promised they'd stop sending letters and stay out of my business, and for the first time, I actually believed it. I walked him to the gate, unlocked it just enough for him to see the road beyond. The gravel stretched out smooth and quiet, no signs, no banners, no tire tracks from Karen's SUV. "Looks different now," he said. I nodded. "Land looks how it's meant to when it's left alone." He smiled, tipped his hat, and left. But Karen wasn't gone yet. She stayed in her house at the edge of the HOA, but she was a ghost now, ignored and avoided by nearly everyone. The same people who once cheered her were crossing the street to avoid her. She still drove past the gate sometimes, slower now, just watching. Once, she even stopped and rolled down her window as I was working by the fence. "You happy now?" she called out, voice flat, tired. I looked up, wiped the sweat from my brow, and said, "No, just peaceful." She didn't respond, just stared for a moment, then drove off. That was the last time we ever spoke. Weeks turned into months, and the story of the locked gate became something of a legend in the area. People would bring it up in passing, laughing about how an HOA tried to annex a ranch and lost spectacularly. Daniel started jokingly calling the road Karen's Detour, and every time we passed it, he'd say, "That's the most expensive shortcut she ever took." I'd just smile and let it roll. The county even placed new official markers along the boundary, this time reinforced with concrete so nobody could try pulling them out again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted everything in orange light, I stood by that same gate and thought about everything that had happened, the yelling, the meetings, the lies, the chaos. All of it over a simple stretch of dirt. I realized that wasn't what it had really been about. It wasn't the gate or the land, it was control. Karen needed to own something that wasn't hers because she couldn't stand seeing someone she couldn't command. And maybe that's why she lost more than a lawsuit. She lost her illusion of power. The ranch was quiet again, the way it had always meant to be. The only sounds were the wind through the grass and Duke's soft breathing as he lay by my feet. The stars were starting to appear, one by one, over the hills. I looked at the locked gate one last time, the symbol of all that noise, and smiled. It was still there, strong and silent, proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting back or fighting harder, it's just standing your ground long enough for the truth to speak for itself. The months after Karen's downfall moved slow and steady, the way country life is supposed to. The chaos faded like a bad dream, replaced by the rhythm of normal mornings and quiet night. The gate still stood firm, untouched and gleaming in the sunlight, and the gravel road beyond it belonged once again to the wind, the dust, and the sound of Duke's paws when he ran along the fence line. People in town eventually stopped talking about the feud, though every once in a while, someone new would stop me at the diner and ask if the stories were true. I'd just smile and say, most of them. The truth was stranger than any version people made up. The county records still bore my grandfather's name, the survey stakes still stood in the same spots, and the only difference now was that nobody dared challenge them. Karen had made sure of that. Her crusade to control the road had become a lesson everyone learned from. Even the new HOA president, Greg, told me during one of our occasional chats that their board had officially rewritten the community charter to remove any references to expansion or access beyond the development boundary. "It's better that way," he said. "We stick to what's ours, you stick to what's yours, and nobody calls the sheriff anymore." I couldn't argue with that logic. But there was something almost sad about how it ended for Karen. Word around town was she'd sold her house quietly and moved 2 counties over. Some said she went to live with her sister, others said she'd taken a job in real estate somewhere out west, but I didn't really care where she went. All I knew was that the once loudest woman in Silver Creek Estates had vanished without a goodbye. Her old house sat empty for a while, the lawn overgrown, the HOA signs taken down. The quiet around it felt eerie, like the land itself was resting after too much noise. It's funny how quickly people forget those who try to control them once that control is gone. Her name still came up sometimes as a warning, though. Whenever someone started acting bossy or pushing rules too far, someone would say, "Careful now, don't go pulling a Karen," and that would be enough to make everyone laugh. Even the sheriff started using it as a joke. One day, when he came by to check the new markers, he looked at me with that half grin of his and said, "You know, this whole mess could be a training case. How to handle neighbors without losing your temper 101. I laughed and told him he was welcome to use it, but he shook his head. "No need," he said. You already gave me the best ending line I've ever used in this job." I raised an eyebrow, and he repeated the words he told Karen the day she lost everything. "Next time you accuse someone of trespassing, make sure you're not standing on their land." We both laughed, but the truth in that line stuck with me. It wasn't just about property, it was about life. As the seasons changed, the ranch began to breathe easy again. The grass grew taller, the fences stood steady, and the sound of cattle bells replaced the noise of arguments. I repaired the barn roof, painted the porch, and finally had time to rebuild the old windmill my grandfather had left half-finished decades ago. It spun slow and steady now, creaking softly in the evening wind. Sometimes, when I stood out there at sunset, I thought about how much time had been wasted arguing over something that should never have been in question. It wasn't the gate that caused all the trouble, it was pride, that invisible fence people build in their heads that makes them think they own more than they do. Karen's pride had cost her everything. Her position, her reputation, and the respect she craved. But in a strange way, she'd also given something back, clarity. The whole town now knew where the lines were, not just on paper but in principle. The county made sure every development in the area had updated maps, and they even used my case as an example of rural property law done right. Daniels told me during one of his late visits that he'd never seen the courthouse so unanimous. "Nobody even argued the ruling," he said. "It's like the land itself spoke for you." One evening, near the end of summer, I heard a vehicle slow down near the gate. I walked over, half expecting it to be Greg dropping off more paperwork, but it wasn't. It was the sheriff again. He got out of his truck with that slow, unhurried gait, tipped his hat and said, "Thought I'd stop by, see how peace looks on this side of the fence." I smiled, handed him a cup of coffee, and said, "Looks about as good as you'd expect." He leaned on the post, staring down the road for a moment, then said quietly, "Funny thing about justice. It doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it's just silence that lasts." That stuck with me more than I expected. We stood there for a while, not saying much, just watching the sun dip below the hills, painting everything gold. After he left, I sat by the porch until night fell, thinking about how right he was. Karen's storm had passed, but what it left behind wasn't bitterness, it was balance. The land had a way of evening things out, like it was patient enough to wait for fools to expose themselves. Months later, the county sent me a new deed certificate, updated and stamped with every boundary verified. I framed it and hung it inside the ranch house right next to my grandfather's photo. In that picture, he was standing beside the same road, holding a hammer in one hand and smiling that small, quiet smile that said he'd built something meant to last. Looking at it now, I realized that some battles are fought not for control, but to keep what's already rightfully yours from being rewritten by someone else's ego. Karen never understood that. She thought power came from rules and titles, but out here, power comes from patience, from knowing when to stand still and let truth do the talking. Life went on after that, simple and good. Greg and the HOA kept to their boundaries, and the town returned to its rhythm. Every now and then, tourists drove by and stopped to take pictures of the old wooden sign I hung by the gate that said Private Ranch Road Authorized Access Only. They always asked about the story behind it, and I always gave them the short version, just enough to make them smile but not enough to relive it. I'd say, once upon a time, someone thought they could outsmart the land. Turns out the land had other plans. That line always got a laugh. The last time I saw the sheriff, months later, he drove by with his window rolled down, waving as he called out, "Still got that gate locked?" I yelled back, "Only for the troublemakers," and he grinned before driving off down the dusty road. The sound of his truck faded into the horizon, leaving behind that deep, familiar quiet that feels like peace. Duke barked once, chasing a butterfly across the yard, and I stood there for a while, feeling that strange mix of satisfaction and serenity that comes after you've endured something bigger than yourself and come out stronger on the other side. The land was still mine, the road still private, and the gate still locked, but not out of spite. It stood as a reminder that boundaries aren't walls, they're the proof that respect exists. And as the evening breeze rolled through, carrying the scent of rain and mesquite, I finally understood what my grandfather meant when he said the land remembers its owner. It doesn't shout, it doesn't fight, it just waits for the noise to fade until the truth can stand quietly, unchallenged, right where it belongs.